Joining us now is Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent, Oliver Crook, who is in Geneva, maybe on his way to Évian, maybe in Évian. Tell us where you are, Oliver, and give us a sense of sort of what's due to unfold here. This was an event that was scheduled to start today on this Sunday, the 14th, has been moved, I gather, at least in part because of the president's birthday festivities in Washington, D.C. But set the agenda for us, if you would.
That's absolutely right, David. Yeah, we're here just outside of Évian, waiting for all the leaders to come down here and sort of host this G7 meeting, which of course includes the sort of classic G7 countries, including the European Union, but has a host of other nations also attending. You have South Korea, you have Kenya, you have Egypt, Qatar, UAE, a number of different countries coming down. And really, obviously, the main topic of conversation is going to be here, is going to be the main topic of conversation that's been all across the world for the last few months, and that is the war in Iran. Will there not be a deal? What form will this deal be? But of course, there are a number of people who will be attending this meeting, including the Qataris and the UAE, who actually will have a sort of very prominent place in the architecture that will come after this deal is struck and what the future looks like going forward. And as you mentioned there, this summit was meant to start a day earlier. What we understand is it was delayed by the absence of President Donald Trump, the UFC fight, his birthday in Washington, D.C. today, which tells you a lot about the relationship with Donald Trump that the Europeans have been dealing with for the last sort of year and a half. And I think it's very interesting when you think about the last trip that the President of the United States had here in Europe. That was back in January. The President doesn't tend to go somewhere without some sort of big idea, some narrative he can sort of lock into. Back in January, you'll remember, it was all about Greenland. It was sort of invading Greenland, maybe taking over Greenland in some way. And I think there's a real question about what that positive story, what that narrative is going to be for the President of the United States, particularly if he feels like he's got a win on Iran, particularly if he feels very disappointed by his European allies that they have not participated in any way in this sort of Gulf activity militarily throughout. We understand that some European leaders are going to put forward a sort of demining mission that could take place after a ceasefire comes into effect. Will that be enough for the President of the United States? I suspect probably not. But of course, there's been also personal degradation between the relationship of the President and a number of European leaders, namely Giorgia Meloni, but probably most prominently and most publicly with the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, who will also be here.
I was going to ask you about those relationships, because not only do you have the president's remarks regarding the war in Iran, at some of these other global summits, you've also seen some of these European and Canadian leaders break ranks a little bit from what we were talking with our colleague Hugo Miller about, was this policy for a while of appeasement and just trying to get along with Trump and really kind of standing up. You have this Mark Carney, what people called his Love Actually Davos moment. You have some pretty strong remarks from Merz saying he's basically being played by the Iranians. How do they navigate that? What do they need to do? What do they need from Trump? Do they need anything from Trump? Is there a deliverable they are pursuing at this meeting?
They still need quite a bit from President Donald Trump. So as much as there has been a bit of pushback, and I think a lot of the pushback hasn't been that public, I think Friedrich Merz sort of broke ranks, perhaps ill-advisedly in the end, by criticizing very publicly the President of the United States. But I think the other leaders have been sort of quiet about their criticism. With Giorgia Meloni, she sort of had to push back when Trump was sort of criticizing the Pope. And of course, there was this question of whether or not European nations would allow them to, the United States, to use their military bases for their operations in Iran, pushing back against that. But I think that very much diplomacy still needs to win the day with the President of the United States, because, for example, we can think of any sort of number of issues that have not totally gone away. There's the trade relationship with the United States. You'll remember that the EU still has not ratified the trade deal. Trump has set the deadline of July 4th for that to come into effect. That is a big one for Ursula von der Leyen, who will be here. There's, of course, the sort of continuing crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. The United States has effectively entirely checked out of that. We also understand that a lot of the military effort, focus, but also hardware has been rerouted for allies in Europe that has gone over to the Middle East. So all of these things, the Europeans still really need the President of the United States on board for. What I do think is interesting when you think about the interpersonal relationship, the one that is really held, and there's been a bit of friction from time to time, it's Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump. They sort of spar with each other. They sort of seem to really quite get along, but at the same time, there's been no sort of cataclysmic downfall. And really, I think Emmanuel Macron understands Donald Trump in some ways a lot better than some of these other leaders, and he's also won this one-on-one bilat, this dinner in Versailles, which I think has proven pretty irresistible for the President of the United States to accept, and that'll be at the very end of the summit. This will wrap up here, and then Trump will head over to Versailles for that dinner with Emmanuel Macron before heading back to Washington, D.C.